Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I may have some competition from barking dogs and high-speed trains, but such is life in the big city. Please help yourself to food and drink throughout the reading. Books are available for purchase and signing. I'll begin with a partial quote from L.R. Nost. Quote, "Tell your story, shout it, write it, whisper it if you have to, but tell it. Some won't understand it, some will outright reject it, but many will thank you for it." Unquote. Through a Blue-Eyed Lens is a select memoir that details my coming of age in Memphis, Tennessee during the decade of 1962 to 1972. My personal narrative is set against the backdrop of that city's public school desegregation effort, which was initiated in cautious, controlled measure in 1961. My book also highlights events in 1968, when Memphis became the vortex of the civil rights movement, the year a labor strike and an assassination brought the city to its knees. There's a lot going on in this book. I'll do my best to inspire curiosity without spoiling the read. The essence, the heart of this book, is a simple story of illicit and ill-advised young love. I would not have written a memoir if not for the advent of this relationship. In 1967 Memphis, two 13-year-old students, a white girl and a black boy, admitted to each other a mutual attraction. I was that white girl. Dwayne Kyles was that black boy. When we decided to date in our limited scope as 13-year-olds, we could not have imagined the breadth of reactions and life-changing consequences. What makes my early life story unique is a resulting and fortuitous exposure and introduction to a significant landscape of people, places, and events. I was neither heroine nor victim. I was merely a young person who unwittingly found herself estranged from one community and embraced by another. I am a Laramie native who at age 7 landed with my family in Memphis after short stints in Atlanta and Wichita. Today, Memphis and Laramie share my heart and my roots, and once again, I find myself straddling two very disparate communities. History is a composite of personal stories. All of history is a direct result of individual and collective action and inaction, decision and indecision. In an attempt to inspire reflection and dialogue, I tried to connect some dots between the past and the present. I think the reader will, in many ways, find the subject matter relevant and timeless, and just may find some disquieting similarities between then and now. After I finish reading segments from my book, I hope you will feel compelled to ask questions and to share your own stories. Music has always provided important theater to life. No matter the genre, it tends to walk right in and take up residence in the nooks and crannies of memory banks, causing reflexive responses to songs and compositions. Associated with people and events in our lives, opening riffs and familiar refrains can bring smiles to our faces or tears to our eyes. Because songs and artists from the 60s and 70s reflect so many collective experiences, I reference that music in my headings. Hopefully, some of my choices strike a chord or awaken a memory for you. Leonard Cohen said, "Music is the emotional life of most people." Alex Gascart, who I don't know, said, "Music is the soundtrack to every good and bad time we will ever have." I concur. In writing this book, it would have been much safer and simpler for me to make claims backed up by data and dates. But statistics and numbers don't begin to explain what took place in Memphis during the decade that spanned 1962 to 1972. In bookending those years, I've tried to be transparent, even vulnerable, as I set loose bits of that history and transpose mere fact into substantive and emotional content. The 1960s and 1970s witnessed a Memphis moment, an instance illustrated by unique relationships, interactions, and events. I was there by a twist of fate, not by choice. My part in that chapter of history is but a microscopic blip, its only significance being the interconnectedness of people, place, and time. I don't know how it feels to be anything other than a white woman. I grew up a privileged white girl in an extremely segregated and racist environment. I feel so very fortunate to have spent 10 of my most formative years in Memphis, where I was confronted with choices about how to respond to that landscape. I was faced with options about how to address people, how to refer to people, how to shape my world, and who to include in that sphere. I ended up making different choices than most of my white peers. Not necessarily better, different. Because of those decisions, I learned at an early age how it feels to cross lines, to challenge perceptions and assumptions, to make wildly unpopular decisions, and to face unsettling and unpredictable consequences. Even though we left Wyoming before I turned 2, my family roots run deep in Laramie and the nearby mountains, where as a kid I spent part of each summer. The 6 months that I now spend here each year evoke countless memories and always bring the promise of new adventure. Memphis, on the other hand, saw me through 10 significant years. When I left in 1972, I now understand that I was effectively running away from a lot of heartache and conflict. Once again, calling Memphis home has allowed me to face some of that angst and to forge a new reality in a city that is, even with its considerable growth and development, deeply and wonderfully familiar. In this next section, I mention Atlanta, where we lived for 2 years while Bob's and my dad, attended Georgia Tech. At ages 2, 3, and 4, we kids were too young to understand the troubling nuances of the Deep South. But for Sonia, that new environment was particularly challenging. In Memphis, my siblings and I went to public schools, while most of the other kids on our street were enrolled in elite private academies. Defined by their socioeconomic status, our neighbors were dropped off at the same schools that for decades had educated many of their family members. Women in our neighborhood were involved in charitable community efforts and country club activities. Theirs was a life of relative leisure, a traditional role for white Southern women of means. They were expected to marry young, bear children, support their husbands, and guide their families through the routines of daily life and social connections. Cocktails in hand and dressed in flowing kaftans, women on our street could be seen strolling between houses on warm evenings. If my mother thought Atlanta was a foreign environment, our Memphis neighborhood must have felt like an alternate universe. This is an anonymous quote. As a woman in the South at that time, you either had a maid or you were one. Let that sink in. In some cases, I chose to write about actual relationships or events in the form of letters. These are figurative letters, a way of telling parts of my story in a different format. They were never actually written at the time. This letter is about an unusual and obviously memorable connection I had with a Black woman who worked as a maid for my best friend's family across the street. Dear Maddie, you are the first Black woman I've ever known. In pristine white uniforms and worn shoes, you work in a house across the street from us. 5 long days a week, riding a series of city buses to and from work, you leave your own children in the care of your mother. I know that you're never picked up or dropped off at your house, but sometimes when it's raining, the lady you work for fetches you from the bus stop. Every time, I watch you climb into or out of the back seat of her car. Always the back seat. You have dedicated your waking hours to the well-being of that white family, and I'll bet they don't even know your kids' names or where you live. Sometimes I eat dinner in that house across the street. You cook and serve the meal, and then you eat alone in the kitchen. At day's end, you wearily trudge back to the bus stop to begin your long journey home, to take care of your own. I like to hang out with you while you're ironing and watching soaps. We talk some about your kids. Mostly we don't talk, but I don't think you mind me sitting with you. I can tell that you really love the 4 kids in that house across the street. They're your babies. You've raised them like your own, and they know you're in charge when their mama's not around. When they're naughty, you tell them, "Go outside and get me a switch. You're fixing to get a licking." I kind of don't get this whole situation, but I know better than to get crossways with you. I'm sorry you have to leave your young kids at home, and I don't understand why you have to work so hard for so little pay. Why don't those people do their own housework and punish their own kids? Still, I'm really glad that I get to see you most days. One day I think I'll appreciate my front row seat in all of this and understand what I was witnessing. When I'm older, I'll surely have a different perspective on the age-old intersection of Black lives and white privilege. Many, if not most of you know Sonia Moore and know that she is mom to Bob and me. She and our dad met at Laramie Prep in the early 1950s. The distinct and pervasive racial divide that our family witnessed as we settled into life in Memphis was a sobering introduction to what centuries of slavery had wrought in the Deep South. In the sense that we represented a young professional white family, we appeared to conform. But actually, the clearly defined, well-established, and strongly defended lifestyles and norms of the Deep South were antithetical to who my parents were and how they chose to live. How and why my parents organically evolved into liberally progressive people remains a question that will probably never be satisfactorily answered. They claim that there was no intellectual or academic exercise involved in the evolution of their socio-political beliefs and related lifestyle. It's simply who they were and how they raised their children. There was no family mission statement about who we would welcome into our lives and into our home. We kids understood and were witness to the fact that our door was open to everyone, regardless of race, nationality, religious belief, sexual orientation, or political leaning. That was a big deal in Memphis, Tennessee in the 1960s. I will preface this section with the distinction I make between desegregation, which is basically a legal term, and integration, which denotes a social fusion of races and ethnicities. Our school experience in Memphis, for the most part, was one of desegregation. There are 3 Black students in my 1965 combined class photo of 82 5th and 6th graders. At that time, it didn't occur to me to have an opinion on the subject of school desegregation. kids were kids. I now understand that those first black students at Idlewild weren't afforded the luxury of such indifference. What I didn't know as well is that they were but three of a number of young black children in Memphis who, for the first time in their lives, suddenly found themselves surrounded by a veritable sea of white people. Some of us white students were simply unmindful of the significance of black kids in our classrooms. Others' responses weren't quite as innocuous. In order to mollify government mandates, the Memphis School Board crafted the low-bar definition of quote-unquote integration as any school with one enrolled minority student. Let me reiterate. The school board deemed that the presence of one black student in an otherwise white student body constituted an integrated school. For the most part, black and white kids in the South had never spent time together anywhere, in any context, under any circumstance. We may have passed each other on downtown sidewalks or in grocery stores as we shopped with our moms. But contemplating the shared spaces of hallways, bathrooms, classrooms, locker rooms, playgrounds, and cafeterias was an altogether new dimension. Those uncomfortable with the emergence of school desegregation must have felt like they were walking onto a minefield. Within the walls of majority white schools, black and white students were now part of a grand experiment, ostensibly to begin to right the wrongs of so many years of separate and unequal. In boardrooms, courtrooms, and living rooms, adults made the decisions and dictated the terms. We children became pawns in a brand new game, being asked to do that which most adults in their own personal and professional lives found incomprehensible. I'm going to read that sentence again. We children became pawns in a brand new game, being asked to do that which most adults in their own personal and professional lives found incomprehensible. The onus was on us as young people to make this groundbreaking clinical trial succeed. My peers and I lived through, in fact embodied, the transition to desegregated schools. We witnessed the good, the bad, and the ugly of that march, however imperfect, toward greater equality. We were given a tremendous opportunity to expand our horizons in ways that went far beyond lessons in the classroom. Though not always pretty or comfortable years, for those of us open to new possibilities, they were critically important chapters in our adolescent development. The experience of being quote-unquote other can be fairly commonplace for people of color. Most of us white folk have never been the lone Caucasian in a conference room, swimming pool, or department store, at a bar, in a classroom, or at a party. Accustomed to, comfortable with, and smug in our majority status, we assume that the space we inhabit and how we occupy and define it is the norm. Even if unaware of doing so, we expect others to adapt, to figure out how to conform to our circumscribed world. The vast majority of friendships that did develop between black and white kids at our junior high school began and ended within the halls and on the playing fields of the school grounds. We were managing ourselves as a desegregated body, but there was little actual integration taking place, as we took comfort in the safe harbor of our cliques and returned to our own worlds at the end of each school day. The very idea of breaching those racial boundaries on a broader social basis didn't enter most students' minds. Messing around with new friends at school within the parameters of sports or chorus was one thing. inviting those friendships into the personal confines of home, family, and neighborhood, quite another. Ultimately, very few of us black and white students at Bellevue Junior High walked through each other's doors, shared meals, or slept in each other's homes. We seldom met each other's parents or siblings, nor did we see movies together or swim in the same pool. There was no opportunity to dance with each other. The very concept of dating someone of another race was inconceivable. So what I'm going to, back up. In 1967, Hollywood released two groundbreaking movies, both starring Sidney Poitier. To Serve with Love and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner brought interracial crushes and relationships to the big screen, exploding conventional mores of the film industry. 1967 also brought sweeping, monumental changes to my personal life, a critical turning point that I could never have imagined. My life changed forever when that cinematic representation of black and white romance came true for me. I'm now going to read parts of notes that I recreated for the book in my adult voice, but they are excerpts from actual notes that Dwayne and I passed to each other when we sort of cemented the relationship. This is a note that he handed me in the hallway after school one day. Shelley, I know this note may surprise you, and I'm prepared for you to reject it out of hand. I'd like you, though, to hear me out, to at least consider what I'm asking. I think you know that I really like you, and I'm pretty sure that the feelings are mutual. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be writing this. I'm asking you to be my girlfriend. There, I've said it. I know how crazy this sounds. Black boys don't date white girls. Please think about it. I'll call you tonight. Dwayne, I read your words to my mom right away when I got home. I'm pretty sure that nothing had prepared her for this moment. One doesn't have to look far and wide to understand that black and white students don't date each other. Maybe up north, on the West Coast, or in movies, but not in Memphis, Tennessee. Though she knows full well that her daughter is going to follow her heart, her concern lies in what others might say or do in response to seeing us together. Even though we kept our relationship on the down low as much as possible, containing our excitement wasn't easy. Too young to drive and too smart to flaunt, we spent our time together outside of school in each other's and friends' homes. On weekend nights, we went to parties. A lot of parties. With lights down low as host parents would allow, we and our friends danced to a revolving selection of Motown, Atlantic, and Stax 45s. In some ways, my narrative stands on the shoulders of that black boy who had the audacity to invite me into his world. The ripples went on endlessly. When word got out about Dwayne and me, my social world shifted to the black community. My closest white girlfriends and I didn't know how to bridge the gap of segregation, so we walked away from each other. I was graciously welcomed by a group of black girls into their circle of friendship. Many of them remain good friends. I only dated black students after Dwayne and I broke up. The definitive line in the sand between the white and black communities seemed to dictate that one make a choice. What were we thinking? Well, quite honestly, we weren't. We were young, buoyed by naivete, audacity, and foolishness. The difference, and we knew it, was that there were inquisitive eyes and dark clouds casting a pall over us wherever we went. Yet, like most teens who believe they are impervious to danger, we couldn't begin to imagine the very real threats that lurked or a vulnerability that went far beyond rude stares and denigrating verbiage. From our limited youthful perspective, bad things only happened out there somewhere to other people, or on the big screen. But this wasn't Hollywood, and it wasn't make-believe. During the winter of 1968, an unspeakable tragedy occurred in Memphis. In a desperate attempt to escape pounding rainstorms on a cold and wet February day, two workers, Ethel Cole and Robert Walker, climbed into the back of their assigned garbage truck. They were crushed to death when the vehicle's mechanical system short-circuited and activated the hydraulic ram, pulling the two men into the garbage-filled cavity of the truck. As a direct result of these catastrophic and wholly preventable deaths, several hundred beleaguered and grieving sanitation workers walked off the job. After serving as planning director for 6 years, my father accepted the appointment as chief administrative officer under Mayor Henry Loeb and was sworn into that position in January of 1968. Though they were both registered Democrats, my dad and Henry Loeb represented polar opposites of the social and political spectrum. Well aware of that dichotomy, the two men agreed to leave their differences at the door while working inside City Hall. I and many others have questioned how Jerry, my dad, reconciled working directly under a man who was an avowed segregationist and obstructionist. Even after numerous conversations through the years with my dad on the subject, I can't offer a plausible explanation for that unlikely pairing. What does make sense to me is this. My father wasn't hired to be a Loeb loyalist. He was hired to work for the people of Memphis. Jerry had a job to do, and as a dedicated public servant, he made sure he did it well. It may be as simple as that. In February of 1968, Mayor Loeb found himself underwater, consumed by the strike. Just after my dad assumed the role of CAO, the mayor directed Jerry, just shy of his 34th birthday, to take the reins of all city departments until the mayor could regain control of his city, a city that was quickly unraveling amidst the divisiveness of the labor strike. Please. Thank you. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his colleagues were busy organizing a massive Poor People's March on Washington slated for later that summer. But because the sanitation strike in Memphis was seen as emblematic of so much suffering and injustice in the American Black community, Dr. King was asked to lend his name and his support to the effort. A march was planned and executed. When that event was cut short by violent confrontations between the police and marchers, a frustrated and disappointed Dr. King flew home to Atlanta. With no new contract for the striking workers in sight, and with a renewed commitment to nonviolence by local leaders, Dr. King agreed to return to Memphis on April 3rd. A second march was set for April 5th. In rooms of the Black-owned Lorraine Motel, colleagues gathered to strategize details for the upcoming march. Everyone involved desperately needed this protest to remain peaceful and purposeful. Thank you so much. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was preparing to leave the Lorraine with Reverend Kyles, Andrew Young, Jesse Jackson, and others for dinner in the Kyles home. Wayne's mom and a crew of church women had spent the day cooking and baking. Men from the church had arranged tables and chairs for the anticipated meal. With places set and food prepared, the host family and church members eagerly awaited the men's arrival. The group of men would not enter the Kyle's house until very late that night, and Dr. King would not be among the guests. With special dispensation from the city, Coretta Scott King flew to Memphis from Atlanta. On April 8th, only 4 days after her husband was senselessly murdered, she led a march of 42,000 silent and reverent mourners. At just 13, I will never forget being part of that grieving mass of humanity, a collage of age, color, and orientation that flowed through the downtown streets of Memphis like a river of tears. Frances Hooks was a remarkable mentor to thousands of Memphis students. She was also the wife of Benjamin Hooks, for whom the library in which I wrote this book was named. The two of them were a force in Memphis. She played a critical role in my life after Dr. King's assassination. The following are excerpts from a figurative letter I wrote to Frances for the book. You have ensured that we represent a number of Memphis public schools in our new youth group, some only recently desegregated. Our responses to Dr. King's murder run the gamut: rage, resentment, and bitterness, shock, blame, and fear. In our schools, the vast majority of black kids and a handful of white kids are outraged and grieving. There's also a prevailing sense among black students that all white people bear responsibility, either implicitly or explicitly, for Dr. King's murder. I would say that most white kids in our schools are simply terrified, afraid that black folks are plotting some kind of mass retaliation. Whenever you introduce me to someone, you say, quote, this white girl doesn't see skin color, unquote. The truth is, I do. Let's be honest, don't we all? Just as we take note of other defining characteristics like gender and body type. I believe it's what we do with that information that matters. We are so often wrong when we jump to quick conclusions about others. We are always wrong when we sit in judgment. The Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council shared a singular precept. Although they had no use for Jews, Catholics, Hispanics, or Asians, they focused a perverse and absolute hatred on the black community and white people who befriended or worked with that community. Their history of predatory and egregious behavior was defined by a wide swath of terror, particularly across the American South. Images of the January 6th riot at our nation's capital invoke in me troubling memories of white separatists in the 1950s and 60s. Professionals, community leaders, and commoners alike, hidden behind robes and hood, or camouflaged in business suits. Men and women who terrorized the South with burning crosses and lynching nooses. The Klan and the White Citizens Council were driven by the same principles and intentions as the mob on January 6th. Nothing less than a desperate attempt to salvage the vestiges of white supremacy by any means, at any cost. All of them, past and present, domestic terrorists cut from the same filthy cloth and raised up in the same stench of pure hatred, all capable of unspeakable brutality. This vast melting pot is not destined to remain majority white. To the chagrin of many white elected officials who have a stake in maintaining a European power base, America's racial demographic is changing and changing fast. The fact that we white folk were born with light skin does not make us special or righteously powerful in any way, even though cloaking ourselves in that deception has certainly benefited us historically. This is when I get preachy. Today, little, if anything, can claim to be truly original, not art or musical composition, not thought or written word. All of us who construct, create, or compose are touched, moved, and inspired by the works of others, both dead and living. That said, I can't profess any earth-shaking or revelatory thinking on the unpopular subjects of racism and white privilege. My own sentiments and frustrations have been passionately and convincingly expressed by countless seasoned writers. But this I absolutely believe. These particular cultural, political, ethical, and moral issues need to be addressed and set on a deliberate course of correction in boardrooms and the halls of Congress, in real estate markets, lending institutions, clinics, and hospitals, on every rung of education, beginning with preschool. Not to mention at the dinner table of every American household of conscience. There is no simple way to tackle these phenomena, which continue to represent our country's most critical and complex challenges. This is a recreation of a note that I wrote to Dwayne after the assassination. Dwayne, you and I weren't afforded the luxury of a simple teenage crush. Our decision to date each other thrust us unwittingly into an adult realm of complication and concern. We never even had the heady freedom of walking down the street hand in hand or of attending a school dance together. Our affection for one another immediately became a problem, a liability, a personal danger. It's taken me many years to conquer my doubts and fears as a writer. As many of you are accomplished academics, I feel slightly intimidated as I read from this next section. I share this part of my story with neither pride nor apology. Attending Memphis schools ended up being for me the best of times and the worst of times. However, without qualification or hesitation, I would not trade those years for anything. In the spring of 1972, while my classmates were preparing for graduation, most looking ahead to college, I nailed the GED and set off on a lifelong journey of empirical learning and entrepreneurial exploits. Higher education for me came in the form of life itself. As Mary J. Blige sings, it's a wrap. By 1972, the city was officially in my family's collective rearview mirror. Memphis was never expected to be on our radar in the first place. My father's career could have taken us anywhere. Boise, Petaluma, Bangor, Sarasota, but the call came from Memphis. That decade proved to be our family's longest stint together in any one place. As individuals and as a family, we had plenty of good times. I can't sugarcoat it though. The 1960s took a toll on us. Not always on the same page, we sometimes didn't approve of or support each other's decisions. At times, the Moore family presented a unified body. At other times, we stood our ground as individuals. But the one common thing we gleaned from our time in Memphis was an irrefutable deviation in our destinies, and as a result, in our perspectives. Without being precisely who my parents were while I was growing up, these pages would have read very differently. Their equanimity allowed me to dance and stumble my way through good times and bad as I came of age in Memphis. My parents were not always unequivocally supportive of my decisions, but for the most part, they allowed me to own my failures as well as my successes. Readers have wanted to know where life took me after I left Memphis. I have no intention of detailing those decades, but I will say this. For those familiar with G's Bend quilts, you'll understand the metaphor of my life as a patchwork assemblage, awash with color and texture, designed and constructed with precious few lines or right angles. Thank you. So I know there are questions out there, like, your parents allowed you to date when you were 13? What were they thinking? I get that a lot. Yes.
I'd love to know about the interaction between you and Bob when all this was happening.
Did we live in the same house?
Barely. We had very separate, different lives. I'm the oldest of three, and at that time I had a closer relationship with our middle sister, and Shelley in her life was, because she was a lot younger than I,
A lot, 2 years.
in many ways other than age.
Yeah.
Whoa!
I'll stand by that
So,
report.
3 kids in 2 years?
What?
3 kids in 2 years?
3 years.
3 years. 3 kids, 3 years.
Yeah. My mom did the same thing.
So our lives were really linked very strongly until probably just before I graduated from high school, and then things started to change.
I think that's true. What's interesting to me in retrospect is that I don't recall our family sitting around the dinner table talking about this stuff. We just didn't. We didn't have those conversations as a family unit for the most part. So whatever we were doing, whether it was my dad going to work or, Sonia running the house and raising the kids, or, us going to school, whatever, we led very separate lives. And I don't know if, I think in general families, white families at that time, were not talking about this stuff at home. I think black families were, because they were the ones whose lives were being shifted dramatically into the white community. So I know for a fact that that was happening in their households. But
So I have read the book and I highly recommend it. I remember reading that your parents entertained black and white people.
mm-hmm.
So though you didn't discuss it in your home, I mean, that example was saying more than words ever could, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So did you take any backlash from your white associates because, actually maybe it's a question for Sonia. And I'm sorry because I know you're bashful.
Not directed. It was more implicit. One thing that happened that has stayed with all of us was that we belonged to a Protestant church and had spent the 10 years, most of the 10 years, in that church and singing in the choir and teaching classes and all these things. And one day we were in a class, and this was, the strike was happening, but Dr. King was still alive. And one of the men in the class stood up and said, somebody should shoot that
At your church.
at the church. And we left immediately. That was
Yeah.
not where we were. So that kind of thing, I think people just didn't understand at all. And the idea was that churches were going to be the last places integrated. And of course, that's never happened.
And in terms of our neighborhood, we weren't really that socially involved with the families in our neighborhood because we were like strangers in a strange land, literally, financially, economically, politically.
I think we were immigrants, actually.
Yeah, right. yeah, right. That's how we were treated, but
People like that who, like us, who might move from someplace else in the country to Wyoming would probably feel the same things.
yeah.
As outsiders, not really understanding what Wyoming is all about, the select Wyoming values that people need to learn. So I think that is something that is probably part of people's natural makeup. It's kind of what they learn along the way as well. That we're in Wyoming, we're part of a tribe. In Tennessee, they're part of a tribe. And people who come in are outliers who don't know the way things work, generally, and are not really welcome for the most part for a long time.
I was just going to, when I read your book, and I thought a lot about what's going on with racism and what Sonia just said about leaving her church under those conditions. I just wanted to kind of equate that in a way with what's going on with the gender issues now. When Matthew Shepard was killed, that was the deciding factor that I could no longer participate in the Christian church. When I was told that, well, it's too bad he got killed and murdered, but he was gay and he deserved it. And it brought to mind it's the same thing, and I thought about these issues when I read your book, so I hope you don't mind that it just kind of expands
Oh yeah,
the whole scope.
absolutely. I mean, it's all humanity at its best and worst, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I moved. Yes, Sandy.
Okay, I have a question before I start. On page 188, is that Dwayne that you wrote or he wrote?
The pieces that some of my former classmates' pictures are in here with their names. They wrote these pieces for the book.
So Dwayne
Yes,
did.
he wrote this for
Okay.
this. Yeah, they don't all have pictures with them, but I put it in a different font to sort of separate that out a little bit. But yeah, I tried for more, but I'm happy with the ones I got. Bob and Sonia and my sister and several classmates contributed pieces that I think are really powerful and important because this book is my voice, and I don't pretend to speak for anybody else. Especially the black students I went to school with had vastly different experiences than I did, and I wanted their voice to be part of this. So I hope that was effective.
Thanks for doing the book. I appreciate it. I think it needs to be heard. When I read the part of Dwayne, it bothered me really bad. Almost picked up the phone to talk to your mother, and I thought, no, you're ignorant. You're ignorant on this subject. Just throw it in the back of your brain and mull it over.
Mm-hmm.
So I did. I couldn't get past it. It was so for lack of a better word, tempered.
It was what?
It was so tempered, his version. I didn't expect that. I didn't understand why it was. I realized it had been many years.
Yeah.
I believe he went to law school and became a lawyer. Oh, I'm trying so hard not to be judgmental.
No, it's okay. I mean, you know,
But I
you're
didn't,
welcome to your
and I
opinion.
still don't understand his letter. It's just, it's nothing what I expected.
What would you have expected?
I expected a little more underlying passion. Maybe a glint of anger, but maybe not, because in all fairness, I've never met him. You know, I don't know his personality, what he's like. Maybe he's very steady. Do you know what I mean?
That is exactly how he is
Okay,
to this day.
okay.
But I will tell you that, you know,
I didn't feel his hurt in
Yeah.
tiny bits or a word.
Mhm.
You know how you pick things up? It was very tempered for me, and it still bothers me a little. Maybe it doesn't bother me. I don't understand it.
Mhm. Well, he was writing it for my book.
Yes.
He was not writing his own book, which I think he needs to do. So that probably has something to do with it. But he expresses a lot of anger and frustration about those days in different circumstances. For instance, at class reunions, he talks a lot about it because we all were there. And
I guess that's what I
Yeah.
expected. What you're saying
Mhm.
now.
rage is a word I would use for his demeanor and his response to the assassination. Dr. King was on his way to his house
Yes.
for dinner.
And that I thought he portrayed.
Yeah.
His anger and his rage.
Yeah.
So
So it was very personal for that family. And very hurtful. I think it, I know it affected all of them for the rest of their lives. So anyway, yeah.
and I
that's-
think what also bothered me that because I'm not black and I've never been black,
right. Nope.
and that
Probably will
he
never
could,
be.
and he could be so steady about it.
Mhm.
I don't know. I guess I saw that as a double-edged sword, and that's it. And yet it bothered me that he was somehow.
Did the other black writers bother you in that
No.
sense?
No, only him. I enjoyed the lady that did the newspaper because she was very straightforward and vocal. I don't know. I
That's
hope
okay, you know. I mean, 50 people can read a book and have vastly different opinions about it, or see a movie. So it's all good.
So if he held back, there could be reasons why he held back. You know, career. I mean, I don't know what his career is. I don't know what his life circumstances are, but it did seem a little restrained. I agree with you. But I kind of got the feeling that this guy's watching his words, as a lawyer will do.
That's who he is. That is
Yeah.
who he is.
I think it's
Something
awareness.
else is involved there. People of color tend to be restrained with,
They've learned
Absolutely.
with their words for general consumption because they don't know who's going to be reading it or know who's going to be listening. And so in a more private and select setting with friends at a high school reunion, everybody knows everybody, they're kind of on the same page, and things said and how they're said can be much different than the way he explained his position in the book.
Let me just throw this out there. I don't know if you all remember when Michelle Obama was our first lady. I cannot tell you how many times I heard, "Why is she so angry?
Yep.
why is she so angry?
Michelle
Or
Obama.
why does she smile so much? Or why doesn't she wear, blouses with sleeves? I'm like, I think in this country, it's really hard to quote unquote get it right as a person of color, and I think people make adjustments. We all do, but I think people of color have learned to make adjustments. And I think Dwayne knew he was primarily going to be speaking to a white readership, and that probably has something to do with it. But I don't have exchanges with him that are any different than how he wrote. So that's my feedback.
And I think it was obvious he did it out of respect for you.
Yeah.
Definitely. It was just that. I don't think
You wanted
I've
him to
still
be an angry
crossed-
black man?
No, I'm not sure. See, that's why I almost didn't say it. Because
Well, I think
I
that's a
don't
fair
think
question.
I have my
Yeah.
arms wrapped around it,
Yeah.
but I just know it bothered me
Uh-huh.
that he did it.
I have no further input on the subject. Yes, Miss
Well,
J.
I'm just going to tell you how proud I am of my profession in your book. I've been a physical education teacher for 50 years, so those of you that have read the book got to hear about how wonderful her physical education is. I read that and I thought, oh, I am so proud of my profession. Woo! Here we go again.
Oh my God, Jane, if I had you, my life would have been different.
It's like, oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I'm leading up to a question.
Okay.
And I am not restrained because I'm a privileged white woman and I can be pissed off whenever I want to be. And that woman pissed me off. I thought, we do not need more of you in our profession. We have you all over. Okay. So you talked
She's
about...
dead now.
So you talked about your engagement in sports and your connection with her. Now I'm going to go back to Bob. So Bob, how much do you think your age, but even more your gender, you saw things differently or the same as Shelley did? Because I'm thinking, I wonder, boys, they've got sports and you've got your music, and of course that gets you engaged with people. So do you think your gender influenced your, or how that might have influenced?
Well, the piece that I wrote for her book leads off more or less by me stating that in my life as a 16-year-old at that time was all about music, sports, and girls. And I can say that that's probably the case for most 16-year-old guys. Any order.
Maybe not.
It all gets shuffled somewhere in there. But that's what my world revolved around. And of course, because I'm a guy, anything's going to be coming from a different place, from a different perspective. The fact that I'm her older brother, that factors into it as well. And I say this in the book too, that it made me feel really uncomfortable. Probably the most that I've ever been in one place in my life, the first year that we were in Memphis. It was a totally different environment. I had come from spending a year on a ranch west of Laramie. That summer, 3 months was my place in heaven. And to go to a totally foreign place that didn't have mountains, didn't have clean running streams, it was hot and humid, it wasn't cool and dry, it was totally foreign, and for the most part I resented being there. That was my primary outlook from the very beginning, and it took a while. took the better part of 10 years for me to grow accustomed to that place and that time. And in some ways, I echo what Shelley went through as far as school desegregation, playing sports with black guys for the first time, as opposed to just seeing black people generally on the street or in city buses or downtown or whatever. We were there together in the same hallways, in the same classrooms for the better part of the day. And that would have a fundamental impact on anybody. Some people negative. They resented the fact that schools were being integrated. Not I. It was a chance to throw something different into my life that I'd never experienced before. And it was just something to get acquainted with, something different in life, as opposed to a white bread world that I was accustomed to coming from a ranch in Wyoming.
Did you have another question, Jane?
Oh no,
Oh, okay.
not just yet. And I'll try not to rant next time.
Well, as many of you know, there were no sports for girls when I was in school. Zero opportunity to play sports. So I became a cheerleader and cheered for the boys who played sports. That was my outlet. And, there's no question in my mind that my life would have turned out very differently had I been able to play competitive sports. No question. Time and place.
I'd love to hear about the reunions when you kind of made mention of the fact that Dwayne at reunions talks openly. And how do those go these days in more present days? Is there kind of open talk among everyone, or how is that?
There are people, white classmates and black classmates, who are very gregarious, and those people tend to engage with one another. Other than that, it's a very segregated event to this day.
Mm-hmm.
There is a 3-year reunion being planned for Bob's class, our sister's class, and my class in November. And there are very, very few black responders yet. And, I know from the last one I went to, that side of the room was black students, and this side of the room was white students for the most part. And, people didn't even dance together to this day. A few.
Sure.
But for the
Not
most
what
part,
you would
it's still pretty segregated.
Yeah.
But that's probably because that's who we were together as young people. We didn't mix it up very much. So didn't get to know each other.
Did you see other philosophies come into play? So you mentioned Dr. King quite a bit. What about Malcolm X or the Black Panther Party? That stuff, those figures.
What did I experience of hearing about him, or
Well, how did Malcolm X factor?
how did he factor into it? I would say in my world that I was conscious of, Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael and the Panthers and that whole scene really came into play after Dr. King was killed. There was reaction and response to Malcolm X's assassination, but Dr. King's assassination affected a wider berth of the black community. And I know most of my black friends became very radical at that point, very radical. And it was just a huge turning point in all of our lives.
So you feel that they saw peaceful protest is not working?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was discussed often.
A lot of what was going on with Malcolm X and Stokely and the Panthers was more of a northern thing, West Coast
Western,
thing at the time.
Okay, yeah.
Until, like she said, the assassination, and then it kind of broke things open in the South for a lot of people.
Right. There was a Black Panther organization in Memphis, a very small one, but it was pretty vocal. And I actually went to a couple of meetings until a car bomb went off. It's like, yeah, I don't think I need to do this in high school. So yeah, they had a presence, but so did the Klan have a presence.
So, in what way did the Klan have a presence? Did they threaten?
Well, I didn't talk. I write about this in the book. There was the Klan and there was the White Citizens Council.
Right.
And the Klan was the overt hoods, robes, burning crosses, extremely violent sect. And the White Citizens Council were the doctors, lawyers, businessmen, bankers. So they didn't wear the hoods and robes, but they were absolutely as nefarious as the Klan. And we went to school with kids whose families were connected to the Klan and the White Citizens Council, and they were proud of it. We didn't have to go digging for the information. They were proud of it. Our sister dated, I don't know the guy's name, doesn't matter, was dating a guy in high school, I think. And she came home one day and said, "Oh, what's his name's uncle is a Grand Wizard of the Klan." And I was like,
Wow.
"Okay, well, you need to not date that boy because that's not going to fly in my world." I mean, that's how close it was. He was a Grand Wizard of the Klan. It's crazy. Yeah, I don't ever remember seeing Klansmen dressed in robes and hoods in Memphis.
No, but it wasn't happening too far away. Memphis was just north of what went on in the early mid-'60s, Senatobia, Mississippi, and Philadelphia, Mississippi, and the 3 men who were murdered and buried in that dam outside of Senatobia.
Right.
That's within 100 miles of Memphis. All of that happened right there.
Right.
And what's his name? The black man who integrated Ole
James
Miss,
Meredith.
James Meredith. He started his walk to Ole Miss, to Oxford, Mississippi, which is about 75 miles from Memphis, from the city of Memphis. And so Memphis was kind of a center of a lot of different things that were happening between more liberal and progressive whites, very reactionary, bigoted whites, the whole black community, all kinds of things going on at that time, during the 60s that led up to King's assassination.
I like to put a plug in for the North. My dad was involved as a Methodist minister in the integration of the Methodist Church. That meaning that the Methodist Church is organized into conferences around the whole country, and that formed a collective. But the Black Methodist Church had its own conferences, and particularly in the South. And so my dad in the early 60s was working as someone involved in the integration and spending a lot of time in the South. One time MLK told him that the prejudice in the South is so damn obvious, and the familiarity of the communities despite segregation. There's a lot of familiarity that didn't exist in the North. And MLK thought it was a harder nut to crack eventually in the North.
Yeah.
So your dad knew Dr. King personally. He drove him, or
Yeah, he did.
around the South.
Not around the South,
No.
some events where
Uh-huh.
anecdotal stuff, but he after curfew, MLK and Bernathy and all couldn't drive, and so he ended up being the wheels.
Which was not a particularly safe endeavor.
No, they
For
were
your
followed.
father.
They were followed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure they did.
And when he first took up that job, they took out $100,000 life insurance policy on it. In 1962, you know, that was a lot of money. That wasn't reassuring as a
Yeah,
as a
right.
college freshman, you know.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, both our fathers were involved some with MLK, civil rights movement. Donna's as well.
My dad was a labor organizer in Chicago. He was working while he was putting himself through college, and he noticed the unions were keeping out all the blacks and all the women for some reason. So that's the life path he took. And so and I was in college too, so I wasn't there in the midst of it, but he was one of the first people to put up the money to bring MLK to Chicago to speak to the black union and people. And then he would meet him for breakfast when he was in the Chicago area. So he was close to him, but I never met him. But I'm proud of his work.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, they told me this story recently, both Lou and Donna, and that you didn't realize the connection with Dr. King until after you were married. Right? Yeah,
right.
I think that's fascinating. What a small world.
Yeah.
So I think the point, it's a national problem.
Oh,
You know, your
There's no
experience was
question.
in Memphis. And
there's no question.
Yeah.
You know, the major difference to me, Lou, is that slavery, for the most part, took place in the South. And I think I don't think the South will ever get over it, quite honestly. I think it is
yeah,
the attitudes and the behaviors and the expectations, and it's just raw. It's very, very raw down there. There is an acute lack of trust between black Memphians and white Memphians. Acute. I see it all the time. And it's just heartbreaking because it's like there's no inroad, you know. Churches are segregated. City schools are almost 100% African American now, the schools that we attended. You know, really the workplace is the only significant example of racial integration that's happening. I think primarily, you know, all over the South. So it's very discouraging for me. I'm sure it's not for everybody, but one thing I do notice, and it's because my radar is up, there is so much more interracial dating and marriage going on, even in the South. You know, I'm just not used to it. I'm not used to seeing that in that context. And so there's definitely been an evolution there, which is good.
not
But
easy. But
national problem, no question. I mean, that's why you-know-who became president. Because we had you-know-who for president for 2 terms, you know. I mean, I think that 45 was a total backlash to 44. Total. 100% backlash. So, yeah, it's national.
And Bob was talking about human nature, and it seems like that is inborn in us, that if there is one step, like Memphis has had a black mayor more than once, I think, and it's like, oh, look, we've done it. It's all better now.
Right.
And we just tend to do that with things that we don't want to really inspect and see what's going on.
Yeah. I had a Laramie acquaintance say to me, well, see, Barack Obama got elected. We're good. We're good. Everything's good. It's like, wow. Where do I start? You know, and I think a lot of white Americans really felt that way. You know, that we'd crossed that threshold, we'd conquered that mountain. Wow.
You mean the white folks that want that mountain conquered?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Well, and as I think you often say, Joe, fear grips everyone. I'm going to decrease my status. I'm going to decrease my power as a white person if I have someone black elected. Therefore, just as you said, the backlash. So don't you
Right.
think fear grips people and has them? Yeah, Obama was elected. We're good. Don't worry about it. And, yeah.
Yeah, I think fear definitely drives most of racism.
Right. Because we certainly don't want to see the whites be decreased in their power.
Don't want to see what?
Whites decreased,
Oh.
white class status
Yeah.
decreased. You know,
Yeah. Well, the midterm elections will be very telling
yes, that's true.
in that sense. Yeah.
Shelley, I love the way you condensed it all into your talk. That was really good. I was wondering how you were going, if you were going to read from one section or how
Right.
you did it. It was powerful, and it really gave it left out some really scary parts of the book, but it was a powerful way to do it. And
Thanks.
did you say you're going to try to take this into some of the schools in Memphis? Did you want to start talking to school children?
Yeah, I'm trying to get into our high school and a couple of other high schools, our junior high school, for readings. Definitely. Churches, synagogues. I was telling my mom before this started today that I think this is the third reading I've done. I've done Zoom interviews and podcast and other formats, but this is the third reading I've done. And each setting has necessitated a different segment of the book, you know, a different representation of what I wrote based on who I'm talking to. Like I did one in Memphis, and I didn't have to go into the assassination stuff. Everybody in Memphis knows that story. Everybody knows the dates. They know where they were. In Massachusetts, I did more of a similar reading to this. All white audiences in both of those cases. Memphis was the most racially integrated reading I've done. And for you people who don't know me well, this is like jumping off the cliff for me. I don't do this. I don't get up in front of people and talk, you know, but I'm learning.
You did a really good job.
Thank you.
Yeah. You know, they say it's always tougher for the home crowd, right?
I actually didn't feel that nervous today.
Good.
Anyway, but
Good.
thank you for coming, everybody, really. It's great.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
Shelley.